right, so hello everybody and welcome to this week's SEDS online webinar. As always, we'd like to thank our sponsors from IAS, which allows us to offer all of these resources free of charge. This includes recorded lectures, learning tools, and even virtual field trips. So make sure you take a look at our website to see all the new info we have there. So today's lecture is by Dr. Nigel Montney, who's a professor at the University of Leeds in Leeds, England. Got his bachelor's degree at the University of Nottingham, his master's from Keele University, and his PhD from the University of Birmingham. Nigel has an interest in the applications of sedimentological and stratigraphical techniques for determining the response of modern and ancient sedimentary systems to changes in external controlling parameters, such as climate change, sea level change, and tectonic basin evolution, as well as to an intrinsic system behavior, such as river flooding and channel avulsion. So thank you, Nigel, for your presentation, and I'll let you have the floor.
Well, thank you very much. Thank you, Simone, and thanks to SEDS Online for inviting me to give this presentation. It's a great privilege, so I'm very happy to be here. And so what I want to do today in this sort of 45 or 50-minute presentation is show some nice examples of Aeolian strata and indeed some modern Aeolian bed forms, and just to introduce some ideas about the mechanisms by which Aeolian systems operate, the controls that govern the way that Aeolian dunes migrate and how they climb over one another to form a stratigraphic record. And I'll try and link that to some of the allogenic controls that operate on these types of systems, climate change and basin tectonics, and other related controls. So this opening slide, it shows the Navajo sandstone out in this particular locality. It's out from southeastern Utah. And it shows obviously some rather nice cross-bedded Aeolian sandstones, and you can see the rather steep cross-bedding. And they're separated by, in this case, rather thick red beds of Aeolian interdune origin. And I'll talk about how these things develop and the mechanics by which these systems accumulate as we go through the talk. So this talk then, really, it's about how do migrating bed forms of Aeolian origin, how do they form sediment accumulations? How do they rise over one another to give rise to a stratigraphic record? What are the main controls that govern their resultant preserved architectures? And how can we account for the complexity that we see in the Aeolian stratigraphic record? And how do these systems interact with competing environments, particularly fluvial environments, for example? And so I'll hopefully introduce this as we go through the talk. And in doing so, I'll try and show some nice examples of all the rock types that we encounter. Aeolian strata, in my opinion, are some of the nicest to actually work on in terms of, they genuinely are beautiful outcrops in many cases. And so let's just take a quick look at satellite imagery. In this case, it's from the Rub al Khali in Saudi Arabia, and it shows selected examples of different types of bed forms that are actively migrating in this part of the world. And the first point I want to make really is that if we want to accumulate Aeolian strata into the rock record, we need to typically, for dry systems like the Rub al Khali, we need to grow the bed forms to a size whereby they start to interact with one another. They cover the depositional surface and the toes of the bed forms are encroaching on their neighbours. And so in these four examples, in the lower part, you can see that the bed forms are either entirely spatially isolated from one another, or they're forming sort of linear chains, but each individual bed form train is separated from its neighbour. Whereas in the upper part, in the upper examples, the bed forms are effectively climbing over one another. The toes are overlapping, and as these bed forms migrate, they're going to be moving over one another. And it's these types of levels of sediment saturation on the depositional surface that enable us to give rise to so-called bed form climbing. Now, we've long had an interest in the sedimentary architecture of Aeolian dunes and related deposits, and that goes back, well, it goes back many years, and certainly before Ed McKee with his bulldozer back in the 1960s. So Ed McKee was specifically interested in relating the internal architecture of dunes to their external morphology and their external behavior, their migratory behavior. And so in a rather sort of image that's a sign of the times, back in the day, they got their bulldozer out and they actually trenched through parts of White Sands in New Mexico, now a national monument. And they were only able to do this because the dunes at White Sand, they're cemented with a gypsum cement, and so it prevents the sides from cascading in or collapsing. But that was a key study. It enabled really for the first time geologists to understand the internal architecture and anatomy of dunes and start to relate them to the stratigraphic record. And you could relate one to the other. If we move forwards in time, well, these days we're a bit more enlightened, I guess. And so we can use the various techniques. We can use ground penetrating radar, for example. And so here are just some images from Charlie Bristow, some of his work, and it shows very nicely cross-stratified units within the cores of some of these bed forms. And Charlie's done great work sort of developing both 2D GPR surveys but also 3D surveys, and so we can relate the anatomy of dunes in their interior in a non-destructive way. So I mentioned then that we really need to grow bed forms to a scale or a size where they cover the depositional surface, and only then do they typically start to climb over one another. And this specifically applies to what we call dry systems, where the water table or capillary fringe is significantly beneath the depositional surface. And so the water table plays very little part in, or no part in the mechanics of dune migration and accumulation. And so the 3D block model here, it just describes dunes that have grown to that kind of size. They're starting to climb over one another, and they're giving rise to sets of cross strata. And we see some examples on the right, and I'll come back to some outcrop examples shortly. But depending on which orientation we view these bed forms in, then we might expect to see sets of climbing strata characterized by downwind or often down migration dipping crossbeds. And if we look at these sets in end section with the direction of transport coming towards us, for example, the lower diagram there, the lower photo, we see large scale trough cross bedding, and that's very common. It signifies the migration of dune bed forms that were quite sizable, they were quite large, and they had sinuous crests along their crest line that gives rise to these classic troughs that we're so used to seeing. And occasionally, of course, we see individual sets of cross strata that can get very thick indeed. They were quite thick in the previous images, but here's a really spectacular example. There's John Howell in the red circle for scale, so a rather youthful John Howell from some years ago now. But this is a single set of representing the lee slope of an Aeolian dune. It's 52 meters thick, and it's just one simple set of crossbeds coming down what would have been the lee slope of a bed form. And that bed form's migrated, and it's given rise to this accumulation. And that's rather spectacular. And so we've got rather exceptional preservation of really very thick sets indeed. And so that's only really possible under certain limited circumstances. Specifically, we need to have accommodation made readily available into which large bed forms can migrate, and they can then pile in and fill that accommodation as they sort of migrate into some kind of depositional hollow. And so this is really the only mechanism by which you can generate that type of cross bedding if you're preserving cross-stratified sets through a climbing method where bed forms climb over one another. So the initial bed form migrates into a hollow, much of it gets preserved, and then later bed forms come over the top and they'll encase that earlier deposit within the stratigraphic record. And so what I've just described there is just shown in the cartoon on the left. It's just shown in the where it says 50 meters. And so we have a topographic hollow, a dune set has migrated in, or dune bed form has migrated in. It's accommodated that set to great thickness, and it's just a single set. Higher in that stratigraphy, we've got additional dune bed forms, and they're climbing at rather lower angles over one another to preserve sets of a more typical thickness. Now, this particular succession, this happens to be from northern Namibia. It's called the Echo Sandstone, sometimes called the Twyfelfontein Formation. It also is very special because it preserved dunes intact at the time that they were migrating. And so you see in the photographs on the right, you see 3 examples. The lower example, you can see a very large dune-shaped stratigraphic pile. That is indeed a dune bed form. It's entirely encased and draped by flood basalts. And so these flood basalts have come over and they've preserved those migrating bed forms in situ. And slightly higher up the stratigraphy, we get slightly smaller dunes. And then we've got John Howell again on that very most top image. He's standing on a relic Barken dune. And you can see the shape of the bed form. John's standing on the crest. You can see the lee slope. You can see the lava flow that encased it coming over the top and filling in the topographic depression in the lee side of that bed form. So that's a rather exceptional mechanism for preserving dune topography. Similarly, we can also preserve relic dune topography through other mechanisms, for example, through marine transgression. And so in the top diagram here, we've got a series of dunes, and they're in a coastal belt. You can see the sea with the wavy surface off to the left of the image. And so at this time, we've got dunes that are migrating around along a coastal strip. If we have some kind of relative sea level rise, we can transgress those bed forms. And there are numerous examples now that are well documented showing relict Aeolian bed form topography in the aftermath of marine transgression. And so I've just listed a few examples down at the bottom there. A well-known one is in the subsurface from the southern North Sea, here in the UK sector, where we have topography of Aeolian origin that's preserved beneath the so-called Weissliegen fascies in an onset of the Zechstein transgression, the Zechstein Sea. And so that's a Permian example. And so time 2, the lower model, the lower diagram, it shows this relic topography, and it's partly degraded because the crests of those dunes have been reworked during the transgression, and some of that material has been slumped down into what would have been the intervening hollows, the interdunes between the dunes. So again, a rather special mechanism for Aeolian accumulation. But most, or I should say many Aeolian successions, they seem to have accumulated through what we call bed form climbing. So where we've got an excess of sediment delivery. So in this diagram, we have some climbing sets of cross-bedding. The dunes are migrating from left to right. And in terms of sediment flux, we're bringing in rather more sediment at the upwind end or upstream end than we're taking out at the downstream end. And so by definition, the accumulation surface, the depositional level, it has to rise because we're leaving some of that sediment behind within our little cartoon diagram here. And so the mechanism for doing that is bed form climbing. And we see sets of cross strata, each representing the passage of a dune migrating over themselves. And so when we go into the rock record, we see plenty of examples of this. Specifically, I'll show some nice examples from the southwestern United States, but it's not the only place in the world. Plenty of other locations show similar patterns. We see thick accumulations of cross-stratified sand, individual sets that are meter scale or many meters in thickness in some cases. Here's Steve Banham standing on an outcrop of Jurassic Navajo sandstone. Steve standing at the boundary between a cross-bedded dune below his feet, and he's standing actually on the interdune migration surface. And then above him, you can see the asymptotic base of the next dune set up, and you can see it steepening upwards as you go up through the cliff. And so this image is quite nice because it demonstrates differences in sedimentary character. The lower flanks of the dune, directly behind Steve, are redder in colour. They're slightly tighter wind ripple strata. The more steeply inclined, paler coloured units above his head are grain flow strata. They're avalanche deposits coming down the dune. And if we just take a step back, this is the same outcrop. Steve was standing where the pot marks are, the little potholes, due to physical weathering action. And now we've got Luca Colombera for scale. And so Luca's standing, and we can see there are multiple of these sets climbing over one another, and they form this rather tramline architecture that's so typical of many of the outcrops that we see, particularly in parts of the southwestern United States. So it's common to the Navajo, but it's common to other Aeolian successions as well. The Entrada, which is the unit in the background, for example. Now, they're both, for the example I've just shown, it's an example of what we might define as a dry system. So the cartoon that we have here on the left, it shows dunes that are migrating. The dunes may have superimposed bed forms on them, so they may be compound bed forms, but the interdune hollows are essentially dry. And the water table, well, it lies significantly below the depositional surface. And as those systems migrate, it's the aerodynamic configuration and the presence of a surfeit, an excess of sediment availability that enables the dunes to climb. And so those examples from the Navajo would be a nice example of that. But we also get systems that accumulate due to a water table control. And so the example on the right, a very different example, this is from Iceland. It's from central Iceland. It's around the Askja volcanic center. The sand is black because it's basalt, but nevertheless, we see a dune slip face, and clearly it's very wet indeed down at the toe of that dune. The water table is exposed at the surface, and indeed the sand is collapsing due to saturation. It's become unstable, and we see these slides coming down the dune front. And so this is a wet system. We can accumulate these types of bodies because the water table lies at or very close to the depositional surface. And if that water table is to rise as the dunes are migrating, then we have a mechanism for starting to accumulate the toes of those dunes as that water table rises. And crucially, it doesn't have to be an absolute water table rise. The water table itself could be static, but the accumulation, the sediment pile, might be gradually sinking through it due to mechanisms of subsidence or indeed sediment compaction, for example. And so wet Aeolian systems, well, if you're not used to looking at these things, they're somewhat unusual. Here's another example from Iceland. This is Skíðasárdar in southern Iceland, and it's a very wet delta plain. It's the largest wave-dominated delta in Europe. And much of that delta plain, despite being very wet, with the water table clearly at or above the surface, it nevertheless contains Aeolian dunes that form entire dune fields. And so note the scale bar here, the bar is 500 meters, and that's roughly in the middle of the image, just because it's a perspective view. And so there are some sizable dune fields sitting with their toes in this rather wet delta plain. The whole lot is gradually subsiding, it's compacting under its own weight, and indeed these Aeolian bed forms are accumulating through that mechanism. Just another example. This is Lençóis Maranhenses in northeastern Brazil. It's a national park. This is just a NASA satellite image. The dunes are in white. It's a very white sand, but the interdunes between them are, during the wet season at least, they're flooded. And so we see standing ponds of water between the dune bed forms. And the water's actually fairly fresh. Although it's a coastal dune field, there's not much saline incursion. And so down on the ground, a rather nice image. With these wet interdune ponds. And so the water table rises and falls on an annual basis due to the wet season and the dry season. But over longer timescales, that water table is permanently rather high. And so during the dry season, these dunes will migrate a little way, maybe a few meters. And during the wet season, they'll become dormant again as the water table rises. And over time, as that process continues, we can generate potentially sets of cross-bedding through that mechanism. And the interdunes that we preserve will reflect the presence of water within these standing ponds. And so these are the types of deposits we might encounter, wet interdune deposits. And you can see that it's not just one or two dunes, it's an entire dune field system with these rather elevated water tables that are rather spectacular to view. So there then, we've got a mechanism for accumulating Aeolian strata and also accumulating the intervening interdune strata. And to some extent, it will be the interdune strata, shown here in the darker coloured oranges, that will give us clues as to the nature of the sediment substrate at the time of accumulation. And so specifically, we can have a mechanism by which the water table is elevated and the dunes might not be covering the majority of the accumulation surface, but as they migrate, if there's a relative rise in water table, and remember it might not be an absolute rise, it can be due to the sediment pile sinking beneath a static water table, we've got a mechanism for accumulation. And so if you take that last cartoon example, here's that opening slide that I showed. It's from the Navajo Jurassic in southeastern Utah. We can see cross-bedded strata of Aeolian origin in the light colours, and they're sandwiched between, in the red colours, interdune units. And over space, if we track these units laterally over distances of hundreds of metres, or better still kilometres, we can see that these units are climbing at very low angles through the stratigraphy. And so this is a climbing sequence series that's a product of the migration of dunes where we've got a wet or a damp substrate. And indeed, if you look down on some of the bedding surfaces in the interdune layers, you'll see things like adhesion structures, so adhesion ripples, for example, and you'll see wave ripples in a few places where you had standing ponds of water at the time of accumulation. If we take a step back in scale and look at the more regional picture, we often see thick accumulations of dominantly Aeolian strata, but where the Aeolian succession, it's not just one continuous episode of accumulation, but rather it's punctuated. And so this is quite a well-known outcrop. It's from the Arizona-Utah border, or very close to it. It's just on the Utah side. It's White Canyon. And it shows the Cedar Mesa sandstone, a Permian unit. But the Cedar Mesa, for scale, from the bottom of the canyon to the rim where the trees are growing on the far side, it's about 120 meters. And within that 120 meter thick pile, we have about 12 Aeolian sequences, each separated by what we call a supersurface. So a major episode of shutdown of the Aeolian system, where the system became planed off, flattened off, the dunes were probably removed completely. And then sometime later, the conditions revert to a more favourable episode for renewed dune accumulation. And this keeps happening. It keeps repeating on a rather regular basis to generate sequences in a sequence stratigraphic context that are each separated by major horizontal bounding surfaces that represent so-called supersurfaces. So planation surfaces where the dune field was curtailed and planed off before the next sequence accumulated later on. And so what I'll do in this talk is I'll go through and show some examples of how this might happen. And so if we take lots of examples of this, then we can see a variety of different types of Aeolian, dune and interdune configurations. And I won't dwell on this slide other than to say there are lots of configurations that people have recognized from their respective studies, and we can summarize them quite nicely in this rather schematic form. At its simplest, systems can just climb, rather like the example A, and this is from Gary Koshurek's work of the Entrada sandstone from the early 1980s. And then example F, from Simpson and Loop and from other people similar to this, we've got planation surfaces which are truncating Aeolian sequences. And so these would be supersurfaces. And we have a whole variety in between. So just to place those different styles into some kind of context, here's a graph which identifies 4 different types. And so the very simplest type is where, well, the dunes don't really vary in their shape or their speed of migration or their angle of climb over space or over time. And so we get very simple stratigraphies, the bottom left example. And so we see dunes which are migrating and they're climbing, but they're giving rise to so-called tramline architectures, very repetitive and predictable architectures that are rising very slightly through the stratigraphy. So that's temporally and spatially invariable. Nothing's changing much over time. With the other examples, we can vary the size of the dunes from the center of a dune field to its margin, so the dunes get smaller. That's the bottom right example. Or we can vary the size of the dunes over time, and we can also allow the dunes to climb at different angles over time as well. And so we get systems that can be spatially or temporally, or sometimes both, variable, so spatially and temporally variable. And so, of course, one of the ways to track this kind of behavior is through a stratigraphic modeling approach. Computers are very good at this kind of thing. And even some simple experiments can yield some quite interesting insights about the behavior of how these dunes might evolve over time and space. And so there's a little bit of software here. It's a thing called Dune Modeler, which was written some years ago now. I wrote it in Java about 10 years ago. And it was really just a way to experiment or play around with different configurations. It enables us to track the positions of dunes and interdunes over time and over space. I won't bore you with the details. What I will do is go on and show some example outputs. So apologies for the rather small text here, and I'll just focus on the main parts of the image, specifically the lower 2 model diagrams, the outputs from this model. And so they both show examples of what we call static configurations. Nothing's changing over time or space. The dunes are active and they're moving and they're climbing and they're migrating, but they're doing so in a very regular way. They're not changing their size or their speed or their angle of climb. And so it gives rise to these so-called tramline type architectures. The higher example, the upper example, is a dry system. The dunes are very large, they're covering the surface. We've got dunes climbing over one another. The lower example would be typical for a wet system, where we've got some kind of water table control with interdune flats developed and present. And so if I just try and run this, I'm taking a risk here, but I'll have a go. There's a little animation, and hopefully you can see this moving. But you can see it's a very simple static system. The dunes aren't doing anything other than translating sideways and slightly vertically through the stratigraphy over time. And so we have dunes which are migrating and climbing. They give rise to this tramline architecture. And these were the types of models that people were erecting or postulating in the mid-1970s through to the maybe early 1980s. And one such example was some of the work from Gary Kosurek from the Entrada, for example. But that's really only one type or one style. And of course, we can have a whole series of different controls that affect these types of systems. So in this rather complicated looking diagram, we'll just focus on the examples in the center there. We've got on the right-hand side, we've got dry systems. They're covering the entire dune accumulation surface. The only thing that's varying between the uppermost and the third diagram down is the angle of climb. Over on the left-hand side, we've got a similar configuration, but the dunes are smaller and the interdunes are relatively larger. They're more expansive. They cover more of the surface. And again, the angle of climb varies. And so we can have systems that climb more steeply, systems that climb at lower angles. And then where it says bypassing in the center of the diagram, we've got systems that are purely tracking sideways. And indeed, in the lower part of the diagram, we can have Aeolian dune systems that deflate. They lower their surface over time by stripping away pre-existing deposits. And so this is a definition diagram. It shows examples of types of static systems. But most of the architectures that we see in the field, in outcrop, they're not these very simple types. They have some variability to them. And so here we see examples where the thickness of the darker coloured interdune units in the dark oranges, it's varying as we track through the stratigraphy. They're getting thicker and thinner. And the upper example shows a rather subtle feature. The lower example shows a more extreme version of pretty much the same thing. It's a climbing succession rising through the stratigraphy. As it's doing so, the dunes are expanding and the interdunes are contracting, and vice versa. The interdunes are then re-expanding and the dunes are contracting. And this happens periodically over time, potentially as a product of things like changes in the sediment availability to feed those dunes, for example. And so the rest of the diagram, the upper parts, I won't dwell on those, but they're basically, it's the controls that are used within this stratigraphic modeling package, and it just illustrates some type of variability. In this case, it's the dune size that's varying. So again, I'll show an example. So I'll just run this animation, and as we go through it, yeah, here we go, it's now running. And so here we go, we can see the dunes getting larger, and then eventually the dunes will start to get smaller again. And eventually they'll then start to get larger. And as a result of that, you can see the dune sets in the orange and greenish colors, and the corresponding interdune sets in the pink colors, they're varying in thickness throughout the stratigraphy. And so it's recording or reflecting the growth and the diminishment of dunes and the associated expansion and contraction of the neighboring interdunes. And so in terms of, well, where do we see that? We see it in a number of examples. So we see it in stratigraphic successions. There's one down in the bottom right here. This is the Helsby sandstone. It's a Triassic succession from here in the UK. And you can walk out the outcrop and you can see these interdunes expanding and contracting within the outcrop succession. And so that's quite well documented. It's a fairly old paper now, but it's quite well documented from this particular succession. We can also have systems where not only do the dunes get bigger and smaller over time, but also the angle at which they might be rising or climbing through the stratigraphy as they accumulate to generate the stratigraphy, that may vary as well. And again, I've shown 3 examples here, and I won't get too bogged down in the details within this talk, but you can see, for example, take the middle example or the middle of the 3 models, you can see dune and interdune strata that are rising, and then they flatten off in the middle of the stratigraphy, and then they undergo a second episode of rise again. And so we've got this change in the angle at which the system was climbing and the dunes were accumulating over one another. And so again, rather than me going through the details of this rather complex model, let me show the animation which illustrates the process more clearly. Sorry, bear with me. There we go. So I was just clicking on the wrong screen. So I'll run the model first, and then I'll show the outcrop example afterwards. And so as the model runs, you can see the dunes are getting bigger and the angle at which they climb steepens. And then as they get smaller, the angle at which they climb slackens off and it becomes 0. And then they get bigger again and they climb at a steep angle, and then they get smaller again and the angle of climb reduces close to 0. And so by doing that, the stratigraphy that they generate as they move, it tracks that behavior. And so if we can recognize those kinds of patterns in outcrop examples, we have an opportunity to try and reconstruct in some detail the palaeoenvironment that stratigraphic architecture is recording and the changes in that environment over time. And so these are dynamic models. They're fascist models which are describing a dynamic stratigraphy in response to changes in the fundamental controls that govern the accumulation, or sorry, the buildup or the size of Aeolian dunes and the angle at which they climb. So in the example, the outcrop example on the bottom of the screen, it's from the Permian Cedar Mesa sandstone. And we see within that diagram, we see some horizontal surfaces that are quite prominent and quite recessed. And I'll just put the interpretation on there to highlight them. And so in the red lines, we've got major supersurfaces that describe periods of time when the system wasn't climbing at all. And then in between the red units, and particularly the main unit in there with the blue infills shown within it, we've got a sequence where the system was climbing and then slightly flattening off and then climbing again through time. And when it flattens off and the dunes get smaller, the interdunes expand. And during times of bigger interdunes, these interdunes were filling up with water. And so in this particular succession, the Cedar Mesa, it was a system that was partly controlled by water table influence. And so during wet periods, the dunes shrank, got smaller, and the interdunes filled up with water. They became ponds, like that example from northeastern Brazil, for example. And just to show, I'm not going to show too much detailed outcrop data, but this is a stratigraphic panel from one of these sequences in the Cedar Mesa sandstone. And the thick black lines, they show the bounding surfaces that are supersurfaces. They define the base and the top of an Aeolian sequence. But within that sequence, you can see stratigraphy that rises from left to right. So take the left-hand part of the panel, pick one of the orange units, the darker orange units, and if you trace it rightwards, you can see it rising through the stratigraphy. And then in the very middle layers, these units seem to expand and then become more laterally extensive, but also thicker, and they're filled with deposits that are indicative of a wet surface. So things like wave ripple strata, much more argillaceous sediments, so finer grained silts and muds that have been trapped on a wet surface. And indeed, in places, you get freshwater limestones and you get freshwater siliceous deposits, chert, for example. And the chert in this example is shown by the green colours, is a unit of chert. And then in the upper part of that panel, once again, you see the Aeolian cross-meadow dune sets become dominant again, and they start to rise up. The very right-handmost part of the panel, you can clearly see them climbing through the stratigraphy. Just in terms of all that I've described there then has been variation that's taken place over time. It's been temporal complexity or temporal variation. We can also have scenarios where things will vary spatially. And most obviously, they vary from the center of a dune field out towards either its downwind or its lateral margin. And so here we see an example where the dunes are getting smaller over space. It's a spatial complexity going from larger on the left-hand side to smaller on the right-hand side. And so we've got this spatial complexity. And I can show a model for that. So again, just bear with me while I run this model. And so here we see, you'll start to see them entering at the left-hand side. We've got progressively larger and larger dunes that are tracking out, they're migrating out towards the outer edge of a dune field, and they're reducing in size as they go. So these dunes are diminishing in size as they migrate towards the edge of the dune field. And you can see the resultant stratigraphy. In this case, I've simplified it down within this little animation, this model, this computer stratigraphic model, to a system where there's no other complexity. It's just this downwind or downstream reduction in the size of the bed forms and the corresponding increase in the size of the interdunes. And so you see the interdunes in pink, they're getting thicker towards the right of the model, and the dunes themselves are getting thicker, the dune sets are thicker towards the left of the model. And so that's spatial variability. And you can see a very simple small scale example. This is an example from the Delta Plain in southern Iceland, that very wet system. And you can see the dunes here, they are actively migrating, but they're also partly vegetated, and that's the slight green colour. But you can see them getting smaller and more spread out towards the lateral margin of this very small dune field. So an example from Skíðarársanda. And then finally, my last example for this part of the talk before I bring it to a summary is we need to add all of these things together. The Aeolian rock record, at times, it can be perplexing. Even with the best outcrops, it can leave us pondering or wondering, how was this generated? And so we can have examples where we've got not just spatial complexity on its own or temporal complexity, but the two are merged together. And so these examples, they show examples of architectures, synthetic architectures, where we've got changes in the size of the bed forms over time, changes in the angle at which the bed forms were climbing over time, and the bed forms are getting smaller towards the right of the models. So we're moving out towards the edge of what might have been a dune field. And so again, I'll just show one example of that. And so here we've got both temporal and spatial complexity. And so I'll run the model, and what you'll see is you'll see the dunes changing size. You'll also see them changing the angle at which they climb, and they'll be getting smaller towards the edge of the model. So here we go. And so now the dunes are getting bigger, and they're rising or climbing steeply. Now they're getting smaller, and they're climbing or tracking horizontally, and now they're getting bigger again and rising or climbing. And at the same time this is going on, you can see that overall the dunes are slightly smaller towards the right hand side of the model. And in this model output, if you just take a look at the resultant stratigraphy, the interdune units in pink, in the very center of the model, not sure if you can see my mouse, but in the very center of the stratigraphic architecture, you can see that the interdune units are starting to join together. And so they're defining wider surfaces that are linking together to form flat areas that would have been between the dunes. And so in the outcrop example, this is again from the Cedar Mesa sandstone, Permian succession. There's Oliver Jordan for scale in this photo. Oliver was very cold on this day. It was about -15 centigrade. So it was a very cold day. But you can see, and I'll put the interpretation on there, there are a number of tramline horizontal surfaces that cut through the stratigraphy horizontally. And so it basically partitions the Aeolian succession into some quite small, quite thin sequences, each bounded by laterally extensive surfaces that we can trace for, in some cases, many kilometers to even tens of kilometers. And so these are where the interdunes have joined together. And I'll show in the next slide, I'll show a cartoon representation of what's going on. And so in this model, and again, this is from a paper some years ago now, 2004 paper, but over on the left of the diagram, we have in the pale yellow colors, principally Aeolian dune strata stacked on top of each other, forming climbing Aeolian dune units with, well, there are interdune migration surfaces, but there's not much evidence of having extensive interdune flats. And so the dunes are climbing over one another. It's effectively a dry Aeolian system. As we come out in towards the middle of the model, where it says SB or SCB, we start to see the dunes are smaller and there are interdune flats between the dunes. And some of these interdune flats have the darker orange colors that signify a damp substrate. So these are damp interdunes, where the water table was close to the accumulation surface. And so we start to see in the vertical sidewall, we start to see some stratigraphic heterogeneity reflecting that. And then if we come to the right-hand part of the model, you see the dunes get yet smaller still. And we start to connect together some of these interdunes into through-going corridors. And along these corridors can pass, well, fluvial systems, channelized fluvial systems shown by the purple colors are starting to move into the fringes of this dune field. So we're coming out towards, well, in this case, it's the lateral margin of a dune field. And we know that from seeing it in a more regional perspective. And so the key thing to look at is the vertical sidewalls of the model, where in the end sidewall near the scale bar here on the right-hand side, you can see that the architecture is much more heterogeneous. So a variety of facies types and not just homogeneous stacked Aeolian sandstones of dune origin, one on top of the other. And so that's from a detailed study of the Cedar Mesa, but other systems, other Aeolian successions, they show similar patterns. And so we can summarize that with this kind of architecture. So over on the left, in the orange colors, are Aeolian dune units stacked one on top of the other. You can see that the Aeolian bed forms, they're getting smaller towards the dune field margin, so towards the right in this cartoon. And again, as we go from left to right, you can see the levels of heterogeneity, the stratigraphic heterogeneity increases progressively. The surfaces in here, the thin black lines, they're interdune migration surfaces where dunes have been climbing over one another. But they're effectively a part of a dry system. Where the thin black lines get thicker and they start to have orange units, like at the very right-hand side of the diagram, these are damp interdunes that are starting to expand or get wider. Where we've got horizontal blue lines, these are fluvial channels that are pushing into the margins of the dune field during times when the system was no longer climbing. The dunes may have still been active, but the fluvial systems were passing in amongst the dunes. And as the dunes still migrate, the fluvial systems migrate with them, and they smear out a thin belt of fluvial stratigraphy within the otherwise Aeolian system. And then, as I mentioned at the very start of this talk, Aeolian successions are usually not just one continuous episode of accumulation. You get major episodes of curtailment, the shutdown of the entire system. And so these more extensive green horizons are major supersurfaces where the entire dune field was shut down. And so this is a way to try and understand the strategy of what are effectively rather complicated, albeit beautifully exposed, outcrops from many Aeolian successions from around the world, and they show these kinds of patterns within them. Just to take it back to the modern, well, here are some examples of fluvial incursion into the margins and parts of dune fields. So in the top left, we've got a quite high sinuosity meandering channel system that's meandering around and generating fluvial point bars within an Aeolian dune succession. So the pale greys are Aeolian dunes. And then you can see large point bars that have been developed as a product of the migration of some of these channelized systems. So it's a fluvial belt within the otherwise Aeolian part of the system. Top right, it's a well-known example. It's from Namibia, the Namib Desert. It's a place called Sossusvlei. And the fluvial system, a corridor is opened up along which fluvial systems pass, and they terminate where the dunes act as natural barriers or dams to prevent the fluvial incursion going any further. Bottom left, from the Sahara, examples of fluvial systems that pass all the way through dune fields, and they might have areas where they pond water during the flood season, for example. And then in the bottom right, the fluvial system is being diverted around the growing edge of an expanding. The dune field is growing, is expanding, and the fluvial system is getting shifted sideways as a function of that. So it's causing the fluvial system to migrate. And these are all examples. Well, it's a paper written by my good friend Mohammed Al-Masrahi and myself. And so I think it's in Aeolian research, but it shows some nice examples. And of course, we see similar things to this in other modern settings. So the photos in the top, or the aerial photos or satellite images in the top right, are examples from the Skeleton Coast in Namibia. The lower diagrams are examples of outcrop data, again, from the Triassic of here in the UK, the Sherwood Sandstone Group, the Helsby Sandstone. And this is from another friend of mine, Mahmoud Al-Kathiri. So Mahmoud did his research degree at Leeds a few years ago. So just to finish this talk then, I thought I'd bring it back to some sort of summary models And I'll just show three really that just illustrate the types. We've got Aeolian systems that are covering the sediment basin surface. We're in a basin that's controlled by a bounding fault. You can see the fault on either side edge of the model. It's a normal fault, so it's a half graben structure. The accommodation is partly filled with these Aeolian dune sands, and they're accumulating as a dry Aeolian system. Elsewhere in this particular basin, we've got alluvial fans at the basin margin, but they're largely shut down because this is an episode of heightened aridity. And we might have a Paleo lake system, and again, it's relatively confined within one corner of the basin. But if we change the climatic control, if we decrease the climatic aridity, we might expect the water table to rise. You now see that the Aeolian system is still active, but we've got some damp interdunes developing between the dunes, shown by the darker orange colours. The alluvial fans might start to be a little bit more active, and they may be supplying sediment to build or keep building or constructing the Aeolian dunes. And the Paleo lake system is now starting to fill up. It has a sabkha fringe shown in the pale green colours around its margin. And then if we show a final model, we've reached minimum aridity, so it's become rather more humid. The dune system has largely shut down. And the dunes, there's a few relic dunes or remnant dunes migrating around, but they're not really climbing anymore. They're tracking out one of these horizontal surfaces. It's a deflation surface. So we're deflating away part of the original accumulation, the desert accumulation, the dune field accumulation, and we're generating one of these so-called super surfaces that's shown by the darker orange colours, a damp water table controlled surface. By this stage, humid conditions, we've got much more activity from the basin margin fan systems, and the Paleo lake has expanded across much of the basin floor. So it's these types of cartoon models, they're founded or constructed upon, they're built upon literally many person years of research from looking at many outcrop studies, obviously not just by myself and co-workers, but a whole generation or many generations of workers that have gone and worked at various places around the world. But we're starting to be in a position where we can genuinely understand the fine details that are locked away, the signature that's locked away within the Aeolian and related stratigraphic record. And that's really the message I want to get by using a combination of outcrop data, comparing it with modern studies, analysis of modern systems, looking at things like Charlie Bristow's ground penetrating radar data, and then also looking at some numerical modeling approaches, albeit very simple ones. We can really start to understand what's actually been recorded in the rock record. And so my conclusions, I'll keep this brief. Systems, when they're accumulated into the rock record, the architectures that they produce they look very complicated, and indeed they are very complicated. But if you understand what you're seeing, you can basically distill most of them down, not all of them, but most of them, as a product of how the dunes are tracking through the stratigraphic succession. And this is particularly for climbing Aeolian systems. Remember that some systems, they are not preserved through climbing. They might be preserved through exceptional mechanisms like lava flows coming over the tops of dunes or marine transgression and such like. And it's really about understanding the problem in 4 dimensions, 3 spatial dimensions, and we need to incorporate temporal complexity as well. So it becomes quite hard to juggle all this in your head, which is why a stratigraphic modeling approach is quite valuable for these types of studies. Okay, so I'm going to leave it there. Just one slide, just to say, I must just thank all of the sponsors of my particular research group here at Leeds. So thanks to all of them. We're very appreciative of their support over the years. And I'll actually leave it just with this rather nice image from southeastern Utah of the Cedar Mesa, just because it's such a nice place to work, a wonderful part of the world if you ever get a chance to go out there. So thank you very much.
All right, thank you very much, Nigel. That was a great talk, very interesting and lots of beautiful figures. So the chat is now open if anybody has some questions they'd like to ask, but I'll start things off. Just how easy would this be to apply to like cores and like?
Yeah, so needless to say, I mean, the group that I run at Leeds, I mean, we are very much supported by the industry, and obviously a lot of their interests are related to subsurface data sets. And so a lot of what we've been doing has been trying to develop strategies for interpreting subsurface core data. And of course, core data is very one-dimensional. And that's problematic because very typically with Aeolian successions, you cannot necessarily be sure about whether one surface in one core can be directly related to surfaces you might see in neighboring cores, even where they're only a few hundred meters apart, for example, sidewells. And so this becomes really problematic. Occasionally, you see marker surfaces that have very clear diagnostic features upon them. So they might be associated with plant roots, for example, or they might be associated with a particular chert or calcrete cements and things like that. They can be used as marker horizons. But generally speaking, the Aeolian rock record is incredibly difficult to interpret from core data alone. And that's part of the reason why we've been building some of these stratigraphic models to try and predict the complexity and the variability that might be present. So a lot of subsurface analysis definitely relies on having analog data from outcrops for that reason.
Yeah, definitely. So still waiting for some more questions. Here we go. So this one is from Stephen from Wales. Oh, hold on, it's moving. 1 second.
Yeah.
All right. This one is from Joanne. Thanks for the talk. I'm watching from London. How can we tell the contribution of changing sediment supply to these patterns? Could changes in dune/interdune size occur due to a combination of relative water table and supply change?
Yes, absolutely. And you can see that in modern systems, actually, because you can see the relationship between the sediment availability and the level of the water table. So when the water table is elevated regionally across an entire area, it largely shuts down the availability of sand for Aeolian transport. And so there is a direct linkage between water table level and sediment delivery or supply rates. And then the other thing that I didn't really touch upon in my talk was the fact that a lot of Aeolian systems are, of course, they're stabilized by all sorts of mechanisms, by vegetation, by chemical precipitates, by plant root structures that are stabilizing the substrate, and even by microbial activity. So a lot of microbially induced sedimentary structures are now recognized in Aeolian settings. And so there's a tripartite control: sediment supply or its availability, levels of water table, but also biogenic and chemical cements as well, chemical stabilizing agents. They can all govern the extent to which dunes can grow or the extent to which dunes might be stabilized during less favorable conditions in terms of dune field development.
All right. The next question is from John Howell. Hi, Nigel. Great summary of lots of work. Does your model incorporate scour and erosion? There have been some studies recently of low angle of climb systems that suggest the geometries are controlled by a few occasional big scours.
Yes, so that's a good question, John. Trust John to put me on the spot. So very much so. So as many listeners might know, there was some work on this in the mid-1980s. I think Ron Blakey wrote a paper called Super Scoops, which were basically large-scale scour structures where turbulent eddies within the airflow would scour down into the substrate, and they would dig out hollows, which themselves might then migrate over time and they would scour out a depression. So that's one part of the answer. If you're dealing with dry Aeolian systems where the water table is quite a way beneath the surface, then almost certainly Aeolian scour does play a major factor. And it's a rather like the Paola and Borgman model for cross-bedding migration or dune set migration generally. You can apply that kind of philosophy to Aeolian systems and say that it's the deepest scour, which is the one that is likely to be reflected in the stratigraphic record. And so it may well be scouring quite deeply into pre-existing deposits. Yeah. With wet systems, where the interdunes are damp or water table controlled and the water table's pretty close to the surface, it's hard to envisage that you would get scour because there's no real way for the wind to dig down through sediments that would obviously be damp or even wet.
All right. So the next question is from Stephen in Wales. And he's asking how does evaporate formation in terms of system depositional cementation control the story?
Yeah, so I've in my talk, I did deliberately steer away from what are called stabilizing systems. So that it just to fill in the picture, the current thinking largely identifies three Aeolian system types. We've got dry systems, which are controlled by aerodynamic configuration, systems controlled or influenced by water table. But then the third one, which I didn't dwell upon, are stabilizing systems. And so that's where all sorts of stabilizing agents can act to preserve preserve, I guess, relic topography. And so if you look at particularly the Quaternary Aeolian record, you see it looks very different from the older, what we might call ancient stratigraphic record, because we do see in the Quaternary lots of examples of relic bed form topography where dunes have been stabilized by biogenic mechanisms, plant root structures, paleo soil development, and indeed chemical precipitate, so evaporite minerals. They can grow within dunes, and that's a much easier way to preserve relic topography. And so that's sort of the focus of a different talk in many ways, but there's a growing body of research, and it's being conducted by a whole range of people. Giorgio Basilici, for example, in Brazil, has been doing a lot of work on microbial structures and their role in stabilizing Aeolian substrates. And so this is very much it is very important, and there are lots of examples, but I sort of deliberately steered away from it within this talk because I wanted to focus on these so-called climbing systems that are so prevalent in the southwestern United States in particular.
All right. Next question is from AGUS. Thank you very much for a nice talk, Nigel. Very nice talk. Have you tried, or do you think it would be possible or worthwhile to try to reproduce Pleistocene Aeolian records with these models, where there is the possibility to link to very detailed climate indicators?
Yeah, so this is again a really good question. I do think that the Pleistocene stratigraphic record holds many of the answers to the problems that we currently face. For obvious reasons, we can relate the Pleistocene record to present-day desert systems where in some cases we have relic bed forms that are still evident. We can relate it to high-resolution climate records. We can use things like OSL dating, and so the geomorphological community, you know, they've been on top of this problem for many years now, and they've been using OSL and radiocarbon dating and various other techniques to really pin down the time component of this. And so that is definitely the way forward. The problem with the older rock record, and you know, we've got this example on the screen of this Permian outcrop, is of course that in the Aeolian rock record, there's very little in the way of absolute dating that we can use, or even biostratigraphy. It's very, very crude. For this particular system, the Cedar Mesa, you can track these things out to a paleo shoreline where it passes into marine carbonates, and they have been dated using fusulinids, for example. And so each of the sequences, of which there are about 12 in this succession, represents around about 400,000 years. But that's still, by Pleistocene comparisons, it's still a very crude stratigraphy, biostratigraphy. The Pleistocene definitely holds the key in many regards, for sure.
All right, the next question is from John Node. Great talk, Nigel, calling in from a very snowy and chilly Calgary. Have you looked at the Aeolian dunes on the floor of the English Channel, preserved by post-glacial transgression?
In answer to John's question, no. But the Aeolian successions, I mean, one of the things that's of interest is that a lot of the marine sand waves that are so beautifully imaged are potentially reworking late Pleistocene Aeolian deposits that would have been in proglacial settings. And so some of the sands, the petrography of them has evidence of Aeolian abrasion or wind action. So some of those sands have certainly been through an Aeolian process, and obviously they've been latterly reworked into sand wave deposits. But in short, to his answer, I haven't looked at them.
How can we get the age of Aeolian deposits, and how can we reconstruct paleo wind field quantitatively? Thank you.
So well, there's two questions there. So there's the age issue, and as I mentioned, dating is a notoriously problematic issue, specifically within the continental record generally, and especially within Aeolian successions. So occasionally we'll have diagnostic units that are intercalated with Aeolian that might give some kind of timing. And so examples would be lava flow deposits, so basalts that can be dated. Occasionally you see vertebrate footprints, or very occasionally vertebrate remains that might give an age indication, but again, it doesn't so the main way to date things is through bracketing, whereby you can define the top and the base, and you might, if you're lucky, as is the example from the Cedar Mesa example, you can trace these units into the equivalent marine strata that lay off on a paleo shoreline, and you can use some biostratigraphy through that method. And so there's a sort of indirect relationship to give an estimate of age. So that's the first part of the question. And then the second part, what was the second part again? Sorry, it was...
How can we reconstruct paleo wind field quantitatively?
Yeah, that was it. Yeah. So now this is really important. When you read the sort of elementary textbooks, it'll tell you that you simply look at the direction in which the crossbeds are dipping, and that is the direction of transport, and that will therefore be some indicator of the paleo wind. But that's not right. And so actually, if you look at modern dunes, in present day dune fields, about 50 to 55% of modern day present day dunes are linear dunes, and the lee slopes of those linear dunes is almost 90 degrees away from the direction of transport along those bed forms. And so the wind would be blowing along the crests, but over time, those linear dunes, they very, very slowly also creep sideways. And it's that sideways creeping motion that gives rise to the crossbeds that we see preserved. And so in very extreme examples, the direction in which the crossbeds dip can be literally almost 90 degrees away from the direction in which the wind was blowing. And so it's incredibly dangerous to simply go and get your compass clinometer out and start measuring the inclination and the direction of dip of faucets in ancient rock record, and then starting to reconstruct the wind direction. You need to fully understand what types of dunes are we dealing with. And that in itself is problematic, because the great majority of preserved dune sets, they give the impression that they are so-called transverse bed forms. In other words, the wind was indeed in the direction in which the faucets are dipping, but I strongly suspect it's because as a community, we're failing to recognize fully how different types of dunes actually get accumulated. And what we see as crossbeds might not be the direction of transport. It might be a sideways creeping motion that's secondary to the main direction of transport and therefore secondary to the main wind direction. So it's problematic.
Yeah, it sounds very tricky. All right, great talk, Nigel. Valentine here from Oslo. Additionally to the spatiotemporal variations of angle of climb you've shown, can we expect a constant spatial differentiation in the distribution of the angle of climb, with steeper angle of climb in the center of the dune field, more accommodation available, and more gentle angle of climb at the fringe of the field with less accommodation?
Almost certainly, yes. And so this is something I didn't get bogged down with in the talk, just to keep things reasonably straightforward. But there's lots of evidence that you can have active accumulation in, for example, the dune field center, whilst at the exact same time you can have deflation at the upwind dune field margin. And it's that deflation that is actually providing the sediment supply to build the dunes in the dune field center. And so over time, not only do the dunes migrate, but the entire dune field can shift position over geologic timescales, and it will be eroding or deflating at its upwind end, and it will be constructing and accumulating in the center, and also growing, expanding laterally at its downwind end potentially. And then the other thing is that a major control on how these systems climb is a product of the rate at which we create accommodation. So it's all very well having the right conditions to construct dune fields, but they're unlikely to ever get preserved if they're built on some kind of stable craton where there's no subsidence, there's no long-term potential for accommodation of those sediments. So the rock record that we're used to seeing, and like the example in the photo, it's in a basin that's actively subsiding. And of course, the rate of subsidence, it will vary over time as the basin evolves. And it will also vary spatially from the depot center out towards the basin margins. And that will affect angle of climb as well. And so it becomes a very four-dimensional problem and rather hard to pin down. But certainly angles of climb will vary. At a given time instant, they'll be different in different places.
Next one, thank you for a great talk, Nora from Hungary. Can we define the wind direction of Aeolian movement by thin section?
No, not directly, just because of the scale of observation, but indirectly you could relate the petrography of the grains to their provenance. And so you could undertake a provenance analysis to say, well, where have these grains come from? And through that process, you could then infer, in an indirect sense, the likely wind transport directions. And so this is something that petrographers do routinely, in the same way that they would do it for sediments that have been delivered aqueously through river systems or along shallow marine shelves, for example. So that would be the obvious approach to take in that regard.
All right. Next one. Hi, this is from Kuzma in Tokyo. Thank you for a great talk. Could you give any comment about the sedimentary facies variations with climbing dunes? And how have facies heterogeneity within climbing dunes?
Yeah. So again, this is a good question. So within the remit of my talk, I sort of dealt with issues at the scale of architectural elements. But if we were to focus in and look at those architectural elements in more detail, then we would indeed see that the individual elements would be comprised of different facies units or facies units. And so typically, for example, the lower flanks of Aeolian dunes are populated by wind ripple strata. And then as we go up the foreset of the dune or the lee of the dune, it steepens up and we get grain flow avalanches or grain flow units coming down the fronts of the dunes. And this assumes, of course, that we've got a dune that has an active slip face. And so you can use that distribution of facies types to say something about the type of dune that you were dealing with. So, for example, I mentioned a while back about linear dunes. Lots and lots of the present-day dune fields around the world are dominated by linear dunes. But linear dunes tend to have low inclined flanks, which are inclined at 10 or 12 degrees, which are populated almost entirely by wind ripples. And only on their very crestal regions do these types of dunes typically steepen up to a point where you get grain flow avalanches. And so potentially this is a mechanism for recognizing these types of deposits in the rock record. And so the lower flanks of the deposits, the dune sets, the lower parts of them will be dominated by wind ripples. And in the case of linear dunes, you might only see thin packages of grain flow strata right at the very tops of the preserved sets. And again, it depends. If these were dunes that were climbing over one another, what was the angle of climb? Typically, the angles of climb that we see for climbing systems are incredibly low, a few tenths of a degree. You're only preserving the very bottommost 5 or 10 or maybe 15% of what would have been the original bed form. And so you're forced to reconstruct everything about the bed form from a very fragmentary preserved record. You're only seeing the basalmost 10, let's say 10% of what would have been a much bigger dune originally. And then the exceptions to that is where we've got these so-called exceptional mechanisms of preservation, whereby the dunes are transgressed and preserved in situ, or they're covered by lava flows, for example, and again, preserved in situ. In those cases, you can see the original morphology and you can know what type of dune it was because you can still see it. And so there's just a few cases around the world where we see these types of exceptional mechanisms.
Right. Next question is from Steve. Says, hi, Nigel. Do you know of any terrestrial examples of Aeolian strata preserved on inclined surfaces, such as sloping unconformities or not a typical basin? We've identified the Aeolian strata, which accumulated on inclined deflation surfaces on Mars, which may be common there, but could or has there been happened on Earth?
Well, so that's a good question as well. So if you look at modern dunes and if you read the geomorphology literature, people will talk about dune ramps, and they'll talk about rising dunes and falling dunes, and these relate to bed forms that are developed on inclined surfaces. They're usually on the flanks of some kind of topographic, it might be the flanks of a hillside or something like that, where at the wind it's slightly sheltered from the wind, and therefore you've got an opportunity to construct the bed forms on that inclined slope. And my expectation would be that these things are indeed out there in the rock record, but that we are failing to recognize them. There's a very nice study by Rip Langford from, I think, 2008. And if I remember rightly, I think it's in JSR, where, again, it was also on the Cedar Mesa, actually, but it was up near the Needles district in Canyonlands, so a bit north of where this photo was taken. But they did a nice job of showing relic bedform topography that then had other dunes developed on top of it. And so you had an earlier episode of dune development. Those dunes were left as a relic topography, rising and falling, so you could see parts of the remnant topography. And then above it, you've got more recent dune deposits sort of onlapping and filling in the hollows between those relic dune topographies. And so that would be quite common, I think. It's just that there aren't many people who've gone out and identified it. And I know that other people, for example, Caroline Hearn, I know Caroline's done some work out in Saudi, for example, in the Rub al Khali, looking at similar stuff from Pleistocene examples.
Right. This one's from Mary. Your model didn't focus on the impact of 3D geometry of the dunes and interdunes on the stratigraphic products. How much do you think these geometries would impact the preserved surface geometry and interdune thickness variability? Thanks for a wide-ranging talk. Very thought-provoking.
Yeah, you're quite right. So the models that I showed, I deliberately showed two-dimensional profiles that was a deliberate action because when you extend it into that third spatial dimension, it becomes incredibly difficult to keep track of everything. And so the modeling software that was written originally, I wrote it, 10 years ago or more now, it was a 2D model of 2 spatial dimensions, but we are actually we're rewriting it actually into a full 3D model, and it's actually a 4D model in the sense that it models over time. And so I have a close colleague, Nar Yan, and Nar she writes stratigraphic models for fluvial point bars, so high sinuosity meandering rivers. But we're currently rewriting some code to develop it into a full 3D model. And then, of course, the other modeling software that's been long been available is that by Dave Rubin. So Dave developed some software in the 1980s when he worked at the USGS, and the wonderful bedforms program, which given the computing limitations of that time, it did an amazing job of doing some geometric forward modeling of bedforms in 3 dimensions. And so he's got a website, the USGS website. I think if you type Dave Rubin bedforms USGS, it'll come up, and it's a wonderful website.
All right, thanks for the interesting talk. Can you output from your models a metric of vertical connectivity between the dune sets or sequences? In the mix between wet and dry systems, presumably there are places where there are no low-perm interdune facies along the migration surfaces, and so you get sand on sand. Is there a way of quantifying the level of vertical connectivity in different settings based on all these factors?
Yeah. So that's a good question, and yes, there are methods, and so. So that's one of the reasons why we're rewriting the code into a 4D model, is to be able to run scenarios to do connectivity analysis. And so Nar Yan is rewriting the code into a 4D model, and then my other close colleague Luca Colombera. So Luca is he's a sedimentologist, but he's also is very good with geostatistics. And so he's using various off-the-shelf codes which are available to do the connectivity analysis. So we can export the model, and then we can slice it and rasterize it into a pixel-based model, and then use the codes for the RGB colors on the pixels. So basically what color code the fascies units are, to then do a full 3D connectivity analysis of the 3-dimensional volume. So that's very much work in progress at the moment. But we've done, just to finish that, we've done exactly that for fluvial successions, for meandering point bar deposits, fluvial point bar deposits.
All right, well, thank you everybody for your questions, and thanks again, Nigel, for an awesome talk. So next week's seminar is at its regular time at 4 p.m. and when Javier Hernandez Milano will be talking about chondrites and mixed depositional systems. So hopefully we'll see you there.
Thank you very much, everybody. Thanks for your wonderful questions, and thanks for inviting me.